What if I told you that one of the strangest Hollywood whispers right now has nothing to do with a movie, nothing to do with a red carpet, and everything to do with a luxury hotel, a powerful owner, and a rumor that refuses to disappear? Because somewhere between Santa Barbara's quiet coastline and the internet's loudest corners, a story began circulating that made people stop scrolling. A story that dragged in a name no one expected to see attached to gossip: Liam Neeson. And at the center of the storm, once again, a woman the internet never seems to leave alone. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Meghan Markle. Now let's be absolutely clear before we go any further. There are no confirmed statements, no verified recordings, no official admissions. What exists instead is something far more powerful in today's media ecosystem: a rumor, a narrative, and millions of people trying to decide whether they want to believe it. So the real question isn't, is this true? The real question is, why is this story spreading now? Who benefits from it? And why does it feel designed to keep you watching until the very last second? Because once you understand how this rumor was built, you start to realize something unsettling. This story isn't really about a hotel. It's not really about a celebrity name being spilled. And it's definitely not just about Meghan Markle. It's about how modern scandals are manufactured. Let's rewind. The first thing you notice when tracing this story backward is how vague it is. No dates, no receipts, just confident language. Sources say, word is, people are whispering. And yet, those whispers were loud enough to spark reaction videos, comment wars, and long threads dissecting every possible angle. Ask yourself this: when was the last time a completely unverified story held attention this long? That's not accidental, because the rumor didn't just accuse. It suggested. And suggestion is far more dangerous than accusation. The claim, as it circulates online, goes something like this: that Meghan Markle was allegedly seen at a luxury hotel in Santa Barbara, that the hotel's owner is wealthy, influential, and connected, that the relationship, according to unnamed voices, wasn't romantic, but transactional. And then came the shock factor. Someone allegedly spilled it. And that someone, according to internet chatter, was Liam Neeson. That's when people stopped laughing. Because when you attach a respected, low-drama figure to a rumor, the entire tone changes. People start asking, why would he be involved? Why would his name be used? And most importantly, who introduced his name into the conversation in the first place? Here's where things get interesting. There is no interview, no clip, no transcript. What exists instead is repetition. One account posts it, another repeats it, a third adds detail that no one can verify. And suddenly, the absence of evidence starts being interpreted as evidence itself. Silence becomes suspicious. Denial becomes damage control, and curiosity turns into conviction. This is how modern scandals grow legs. And Santa Barbara plays a critical role here. Santa Barbara isn't just a scenic town with palm trees and ocean views. It's known in celebrity circles for something very specific: privacy. Not the loud, showy kind, the quiet kind. The kind where famous people go precisely because no one is supposed to notice them. Which raises an uncomfortable contradiction. If Santa Barbara is known for discretion, why is this story so loud? That contradiction is the first crack in the narrative, and also the reason it spread. Because rumors thrive best in places that are supposed to be silent. And when you add a luxury hotel into the mix, the imagination fills in the blanks. Think about it. Hotels are neutral spaces. They host business meetings, family vacations, closed-door negotiations. But online storytelling doesn't care about neutrality. It cares about drama. So suddenly, a hotel becomes a setting, an owner becomes a character, and a guest becomes a plot twist. And Meghan Markle, whether people admit it or not, has become one of the most adaptable characters in internet storytelling. To her critics, every move is suspicious. To her defenders, every rumor is targeted. And to algorithms, she's engagement gold. Now layer Liam Neeson's name on top of that. A man known for avoiding gossip. A man rarely associated with Hollywood mess. A man whose reputation gives the rumor weight, even if he never actually said a word. Ask yourself this honestly. If this rumor had no famous male name attached to it, would you still be watching right now? Probably not. That's the hook. And whoever built this narrative understood exactly how to bait it. But here's the part most people skip over. Why now? Why did this story surface at this exact moment? Because celebrity rumors don't exist in a vacuum. They rise when something else is happening. A distraction, a competing headline, a moment when attention is up for grabs. And when you examine the timing, something feels engineered. Not proven, not confirmed, but deliberate. And that's what makes this story dangerous. Not because it's true, but because it doesn't need to be. In the age of clicks, repetition replaces evidence. Emotion replaces logic. And labels stick faster than facts. By the time someone asks for proof, the audience has already chosen sides. And here's the most uncomfortable question of all. What if the real scandal isn't whether this rumor is true, but how easily people want it to be? Because outrage is addictive, judgment feels powerful, and believing you've seen through someone gives a sense of control. That's why stories like this don't die. They mutate. They absorb new details, new angles, new villains. And as we move forward, you're going to see how this narrative was shaped step by step, not by evidence, but by incentive. Because once we trace where the rumor actually started, and who amplified it, and who stayed silent while it spread, everything starts to look very different. But what comes next raises an even bigger question. Why did this particular rumor refuse to disappear, while hundreds of others vanished overnight? And once you see the pattern, you won't unsee it. Why did this particular rumor refuse to disappear, while hundreds of others vanished overnight? That's the question most people never stop to ask. Because if you spend enough time watching celebrity gossip cycles, you start noticing a pattern. Stories flare up. They burn hot for a few hours, maybe a day. Then they fade, replaced by the next outrage, the next distraction, the next manufactured shock. But this one didn't behave that way. It lingered. It resurfaced in comment sections days later. It reappeared in reaction videos that pretended not to endorse it, while repeating it anyway. It crept into discussions that weren't even about Meghan Markle to begin with. And that tells us something important. This rumor didn't spread because of proof. It spread because it fit a narrative people already wanted to believe. Think about that for a moment. When a story aligns perfectly with existing bias, it doesn't need evidence. It only needs permission. And the internet gave it that permission almost instantly. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to admit. Most viral scandals are not discovered. They're assembled, piece by piece, phrase by phrase, through implication rather than declaration. That's why this story feels so slippery when you try to pin it down. Ask someone where they heard it, and they'll say, "It was everywhere." Ask them who said it first, and suddenly no one knows. Ask them what exactly was said, and the details start changing. That's not a bug. That's the design. Because a rumor that's too specific can be disproven. A rumor that stays vague can live forever. And this one mastered vagueness. It never says exactly when. It never says exactly how. It never says exactly what was exchanged, promised, or agreed upon. It just hints. And hints are powerful, especially when they're wrapped in luxury settings, wealthy figures, and a public personality people already love to dissect. Let's talk about the psychology for a second. Why do stories involving hotels, private meetings, and exclusive access grab people so hard? Because they tap into secrecy. And secrecy triggers imagination. When people don't know what happened behind closed doors, they fill in the blanks with whatever confirms their worldview. For critics, the story becomes proof of manipulation. For supporters, it becomes proof of persecution. For everyone else, it becomes entertainment. And entertainment doesn't require truth, it requires tension. That tension grows even stronger when the person at the center has a long history of media conflict. Meghan Markle is not just a celebrity in this ecosystem. She's a symbol. To some, she represents ambition. To others, disruption. To others, controversy personified. Which means any rumor involving her arrives preloaded with emotion. And here's where the contradiction really sharpens. The people spreading this rumor often say they don't trust mainstream media. Yet they rely on the same tactics tabloids have used for decades. Anonymous sources, implied authority, carefully chosen words that suggest certainty without providing it. It's tabloids without the masthead. And then there's the Liam Neeson angle. Ask yourself this. Why does attaching his name instantly elevate the rumor's perceived credibility? Because credibility is transferable. You don't need him to confirm anything. You just need people to believe he could. That's the trick. The rumor never claims he held a press conference. It never points to an interview clip. It just lets the audience assume that someone like him wouldn't be mentioned unless there was something there. An assumption does the rest of the work. But here's what makes this especially revealing. No matter how many times the rumor is repeated, no primary source ever surfaces. No staff member, no document, no verified eyewitness willing to go on record. Instead, what you see is a chain reaction. One creator references another. Another paraphrases a comment. Another adds emotional emphasis. And suddenly, repetition creates the illusion of confirmation. This is how misinformation survives without lying outright. It dances around the truth instead of confronting it. And the audience plays along, often without realizing it. Because asking for proof feels boring. But speculation feels exciting. And excitement wins online. Now let's zoom out. Why does the idea of transactional relationships bother people so deeply? Because it threatens the myth of authenticity. We like to believe that success comes from talent, love comes from sincerity, and power is earned fairly. A rumor like this suggests otherwise. It suggests that influence can be accessed quietly, that status can be leveraged privately, that morality is flexible behind luxury doors. Whether or not that's true doesn't matter to the rumor's survival. What matters is that it feels plausible enough to provoke outrage. And outrage is engagement's favorite fuel. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. When you strip away the names, the settings, and the dramatic language, this rumor doesn't actually tell a story. It implies one. An implication allows everyone to project their own version. That's why comment sections are filled with certainty, even though no one agrees on the details. Everyone is reacting to a different imaginary version of the same rumor. That's how it avoids collapse. And the longer it stays alive, the more people assume there must be something to it. Because surely, if it weren't true, it would have gone away by now, right? That's the trap. Longevity becomes proof. Silence becomes guilt. And skepticism becomes suspicion. And once that mental shift happens, the narrative no longer needs maintenance. The audience maintains it themselves. They repeat it. They defend it. They fight over it. And in doing so, they turn a rumor into a cultural moment. This is why stories like this are so dangerous. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're sticky. They don't announce themselves as fiction. They don't present themselves as fact. They live in the gray space where doubt and desire overlap. And that gray space is where reputations erode quietly. Now here's the question no one wants to answer. What responsibility do creators have when repeating stories like this? Is it enough to say allegedly and move on? Or does repeating a rumor, even critically, still contribute to its spread? Because every time this story is retold, it gains another layer of legitimacy. Even when framed as analysis, even when framed as skepticism, attention is currency. And this rumor has become very expensive. Which brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. If this story wasn't sustained by evidence, if it wasn't sustained by confirmation, then what exactly kept it alive? The answer lies in where it began. Not geographically, digitally. Because once you trace the earliest mentions, the first vague posts, the first suggestive phrasing, a pattern starts to emerge. A pattern tied to timing, to incentives, and to an ecosystem that rewards controversy far more than clarity. And once you see that origin point, everything else starts to make sense. But what we're about to uncover next isn't about Meghan Markle at all. It's about how rumors are born, nurtured, and weaponized online, and why some names are chosen as catalysts. Because when you follow the trail far enough back, you don't find a scandal, you find a strategy. And what comes next will change how you look at celebrity leaks, forever. Oh, where did it actually begin? Not the version you've heard repeated, not the polished retellings, not the confident summaries delivered like facts. The real beginning is messier, quieter, and far less glamorous. Because when you strip this rumor down to its earliest digital footprints, you don't find a bombshell. You find a whisper. And whispers, when placed in the right environment, can become explosions. This is chapter 1, the moment before the moment, the phase where almost no one was paying attention. And that's exactly why it worked. If you scroll far enough back, past the viral clips, past the reaction thumbnails, past the emotionally loaded headlines, you arrive at something surprisingly small. A post that didn't even look important at first. No bold claims. No names in the headline. Just a vague suggestion buried in a comment thread that most people would have skipped. That's how these stories are born. Not with certainty, with curiosity. The post didn't say this happened. It said something much more effective. I heard something strange. That's all it takes. Because the moment someone frames information as overheard rather than declared, it disarms skepticism. It feels casual, unthreatening, almost harmless. And people lean in. The earliest mentions didn't accuse anyone of anything. They didn't even describe a relationship. They hinted at proximity. A luxury hotel. A well-known guest. A powerful owner. Nothing illegal. Nothing explicit. Just enough to make readers connect dots that weren't actually drawn. And here's the key detail most people miss. Those first posts didn't go viral. They simmered. They lived in small communities where speculation is currency and ambiguity is protection. Spaces where people pride themselves on connecting patterns rather than verifying facts. In those spaces, uncertainty isn't a flaw. It's a feature. Because certainty ends conversation. Uncertainty multiplies it. So the comments started filling in gaps. Someone asked when it happened. Someone else guessed. Another said they'd heard something similar months ago. No one checked. No one needed to. Because the goal wasn't accuracy. It was escalation. This is the moment where the rumor could have died. Most do. They get ignored. They fail to spark imagination. They sink quietly. But this one hit something sensitive. It intersected with an existing narrative people already felt strongly about. And that's when the second phase began. Amplification. Not from major outlets. Not from journalists. From accounts that understood how attention works. They didn't repeat the rumor directly. They reframed it. What's going on with Meghan Markle and this hotel everyone's whispering about? Notice the wording. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't confirm. It invites. And invitations travel faster than statements. Now the rumor had a hook. People clicked not because they believed it, but because they wanted to know what others were saying. And once they were inside, the framing did the rest. Each retelling added a little color, a little confidence, a little certainty that hadn't existed before. This is where the story mutated. Originally, it was about a location. Now it was about intent. Originally, it was about proximity. Now it was about implication. And this is where timing mattered. Because this rumor didn't surface in a quiet media cycle. It surfaced when attention was fragmented. Multiple celebrity narratives competing. Audiences fatigued by predictable scandals. And suddenly, here was something different. Not loud. Not obvious. Suspiciously subtle. That subtlety made people feel smart for noticing it. And when people feel smart, they share. But still, no names. Not yet. That came later. And when it did, everything changed. Because the introduction of a new name didn't come with evidence. It came with authority. Someone commented something along the lines of, I heard even Liam Neeson mentioned it. No context. No source. Just a sentence dropped like bait. And that was all it took. Because now the rumor had gravity. It wasn't just anonymous chatter anymore. It had a respectable silhouette. And here's the contradiction that fuels the entire machine. The people repeating this line often insist they don't trust celebrities. Yet the moment a respected celebrity's name enters the narrative, the story gains credibility. That's not logic. That's psychology. Authority, even implied authority, bends perception. And once that name appeared, the rumor crossed an invisible line. From niche speculation to mainstream curiosity, creators who had never touched blind items before suddenly felt safe discussing it, as long as they used the right word. Allegedly, that single word has become the internet's favorite shield. It doesn't verify. It doesn't protect the subject. It protects the speaker. And now the story could travel openly. But here's the thing. No one stopped to ask the most basic question. Why would someone like Liam Neeson be casually discussing something like this? There was no motive presented. No context offered. The rumors simply assumed plausibility. And people accepted it because it felt dramatic. This is where narrative convenience replaces logic. In real life, people don't casually spill explosive secrets without consequence. In online storytelling, they do it all the time. Because consequences don't exist in comment sections. Now let's talk about Santa Barbara for a moment. Not as a place, but as a symbol. In rumor culture, certain locations carry meaning. They signal wealth, discretion, exclusivity. By placing the story there, the rumor gained atmosphere. But something else happened during this phase that most people overlook. Contradictions began appearing almost immediately. Different timelines, different hotel descriptions, different interpretations of the owner's role. Normally, contradictions weaken a story. Here, they strengthened it. Because debate fuels visibility. Every disagreement kept the rumor alive longer. Supporters argued plausibility. Skeptics argued logic. And in between, the algorithm watched engagement climb. That's when content creators stepped in, not necessarily to lie, but to participate. Reaction videos. Let's talk about this segments. Long monologues that claim neutrality while repeating every detail. And repetition is what transforms whispers into narratives. Even when framed critically, every retelling reinforces memory. Now the rumor had reached its most dangerous stage. Normalization. People stopped asking if it was true. They started asking what it meant. What it said about Meghan Markle. What it said about power. What it said about Hollywood. That shift is subtle, but irreversible. Once a story becomes symbolic, facts become irrelevant. And that's when silence gets misinterpreted. Because neither Meghan Markle nor Liam Neeson publicly addressed the rumor. Not because it was true, but because addressing rumors often makes them worse. However, the internet doesn't interpret silence as strategy. It interprets it as confirmation. And that's how a story with no proof gained momentum. Not through evidence, through expectation. So let's pause here and ask the question that actually matters. If this rumor began as vague speculation, if it was amplified through implication, if it thrived on repetition rather than verification, then why did it survive longer than most? The answer isn't found in the people it targets. It's found in the system that rewards it. Because the origin of this rumor tells us something unsettling about how stories are chosen, shaped, and sustained online. And in the next section, we're going to look at why attaching certain names, especially unexpected ones, acts like fuel on a fire. Because once you understand why some names are irresistible to rumor culture, you'll start to see this pattern everywhere. And you'll realize this story was never random. It was inevitable. Why did one single name change everything? Why did a rumor that had been floating quietly suddenly feel heavier, more believable, almost dangerous? That question takes us directly into Chapter 2. Because the moment Liam Neeson was attached to this narrative, the entire rumor crossed an invisible threshold. Before that, it was just noise. After that, it felt like something else. Authority. And authority doesn't need proof to influence perception. It only needs to exist. Let's talk honestly for a moment. Liam Neeson is not a name people associate with gossip. He's not known for tabloid appearances. He doesn't live in interview cycles explaining his private opinions, which is exactly why the rumor benefited from borrowing his reputation. In rumor culture, some names act like accelerants, not because they confirm anything, but because they disarm doubt. Ask yourself this. If the same story had claimed it was spilled by a random influencer, would anyone still be discussing it? Probably not. The power wasn't in what was said. It was in who was allegedly connected to it. But here's the contradiction most people ignored. There is no public record of Liam Neeson commenting on Meghan Markle's private life. No clip, no quote, no secondhand witness willing to go on record. And yet his name circulated with confidence. That confidence didn't come from evidence. It came from assumption. Because people assumed certain figures wouldn't be mentioned unless there was a reason. That assumption is the entire mechanism. Once it takes hold, the rumor doesn't need support anymore. It supports itself. Now think about the psychology at play. When audiences see a respected, older, serious figure attached to a rumor, their critical guard drops. Not completely, just enough. They stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "Why would he say that?" That shift is subtle but massive. It moves the conversation away from verification and toward interpretation. And interpretation is where stories grow. This is where speculation becomes storytelling. Creators began framing the rumor differently. Instead of questioning its validity, they questioned its implications. What did it suggest? What did it reveal? What did it say about Hollywood power dynamics? Notice how quickly the focus moved away from proof. Because proof slows momentum. Implication speeds it up. And then there's the Meghan Markle factor. Meghan Markle is one of the most polarizing figures in modern media, not because of one action, but because she sits at the intersection of multiple cultural tensions. Royal tradition versus modern celebrity. Privacy versus visibility. Sympathy versus suspicion. So when her name appears in a rumor, people don't react neutrally. They react emotionally. Some are already convinced of wrongdoing. Some are already convinced of persecution. Either way, the rumor doesn't land on empty ground. It lands on preloaded belief. And here's where the narrative became especially sticky. The rumor didn't portray Meghan as reckless. It portrayed her as strategic. That distinction matters. Because strategic behavior invites judgment. It frames the subject as calculating rather than impulsive. And that framing aligns perfectly with existing stereotypes critics already hold. Which means the rumor didn't need to convince anyone. It only needed to activate what was already there. But let's slow down and ask the uncomfortable question. Why does the idea of a transactional relationship trigger such intense reaction? Because it challenges the story people want to tell themselves. We like our public figures neatly categorized. Heroes, villains, victims. Transactional narratives blur those lines. They suggest agency where people want innocence, manipulation where people want sincerity, and ambiguity makes people uncomfortable. So they resolve it emotionally. They choose a side. And once sides are chosen, facts stop matching. Now here's where the Liam Neeson angle becomes even more revealing. The rumor never explains why he would be involved. No motive is offered. No context. Just the implication that he spilled something. That vagueness is intentional. Because if you explain too much, people can challenge it. But if you leave it open-ended, people fill in the gaps themselves. They imagine private conversations, casual remarks, offhand comments taken out of context. None of it needs to be real. It just needs to feel possible. And possibility is enough. This is how rumor culture weaponizes plausibility. Not truth. Not evidence. Just the sense that something like this could happen. Now consider how silence plays into this. Neither Liam Neeson nor Meghan Markle publicly responded. From a legal and strategic standpoint, that makes sense. Engaging with rumors often amplifies them. But in the court of public opinion, silence is rarely interpreted as restraint. It's interpreted as avoidance, which feeds the narrative. People begin saying things like, if it weren't true, someone would deny it. If it were completely false, it would be shut down. Those statements feel logical, but they're not. They ignore how modern media works. They ignore how responding to every rumor is impossible. And they ignore how denial often becomes a headline of its own. But rumor culture doesn't care about those nuances. It thrives on the absence of clarity. And that's where this story reached a new level. Because now, it wasn't just about what allegedly happened. It was about why no one was stopping it. And that created suspicion. Suspicion led to theorizing. Theorizing led to more content. More content led to algorithmic amplification. This is the feedback loop. And once a story enters that loop, it doesn't matter who started it anymore. It becomes communal. Everyone owns a piece of it, and everyone feels justified repeating it. But here's the irony. The more this rumor spread, the less specific it became. Details blurred instead of sharpening. Timelines shifted. Descriptions changed. The role of the hotel owner fluctuated depending on who was telling the story. In a fact-based narrative, that would be a red flag. In rumor culture, it's a sign of vitality. It means the story is adaptable. It can survive scrutiny because it doesn't commit to anything concrete. And adaptability is survival. This is why attaching Liam Neeson's name was such a turning point. Not because it confirmed anything, but because it stabilized belief. People stopped asking where the rumor came from. They assumed it must have come from somewhere legitimate. And that assumption carried the story forward. Now ask yourself this. How many times have you seen a story repeated so often that you assumed it must be true, even though you couldn't point to a source? That's not coincidence. That's repetition doing its job. And repetition is most effective when paired with a credible silhouette. Not a quote, not a clip, just a name. But there's one more layer to this that almost no one discusses. Attaching a respected male name to a rumor about a woman does something very specific. It reframes the power dynamic. Suddenly, the story isn't just about her actions. It's about validation from a male authority. And that validation, even implied, carries cultural weight. It suggests oversight, judgment, exposure. And whether people admit it or not, that taps into deep-seated biases. The idea that a woman's behavior becomes real only when acknowledged by a man. That's why this rumor hit harder than others. Not because it was stronger, but because it leaned into an old, familiar structure. and structures are powerful. They feel true even when the content isn't. So where does that leave us? We have a rumor with no confirmed origin, a narrative shaped by implication, a respected name used as credibility scaffolding, and an audience primed to believe or condemn long before facts enter the room. Which leads us to the next uncomfortable question. If attaching a single name can transform a whisper into a storm, who decides which names get used? And why are some figures irresistible to rumor culture, while others are ignored completely? Because once you understand how certain names function as narrative fuel, you'll start to see that this story wasn't accidental at all. It was constructed. And the next section reveals exactly why Santa Barbara, and luxury spaces like it, are the perfect backdrop for stories like this to thrive. Because location isn't just setting, it's symbolism. And that symbolism does a lot of invisible work. Why does a place matter so much in a story like this? Why does the mere mention of Santa Barbara instantly make a rumor feel more believable, more cinematic, more real? That question pulls us straight into Chapter 3. Because location is never just a backdrop. In modern scandal culture, location is a character. And Santa Barbara plays its role perfectly. Before we even talk about hotels, owners, or guests, we need to understand the mythology of the place itself. Santa Barbara isn't loud like Hollywood. It doesn't scream celebrity the way Beverly Hills does. It whispers wealth. It signals retreat, exclusivity, a place where powerful people go not to be seen, but to disappear. That perception alone does half the work for a rumor. When a story is set somewhere private, audiences assume secrecy. When they assume secrecy, they assume hidden behavior. And once that assumption is in place, the imagination takes over. Here's the contradiction. Santa Barbara is known for discretion precisely because most of what happens there is boring. Business meetings, family vacations, quiet dinners, closed-door negotiations that never become stories. But rumor culture flips that logic. It says, if nothing is visible, something must be hidden. That's how absence becomes suspicion. And in this narrative, Santa Barbara wasn't chosen randomly. It's a place that already carries symbolic meaning. Old money, soft power, influence without spectacle. So when people hear luxury hotel in Santa Barbara, they don't picture a lobby. They picture private entrances, staff trained not to speak, agreements sealed without witnesses. Even if none of that is true, the imagery is enough. And imagery is everything. This is why so many rumors gravitate toward places like this. Not because things happen there more often, but because they're believable settings for imagined events. Now let's talk about hotels specifically. Hotels occupy a strange space in storytelling. They're public, but not really. They're shared, but segmented. They host thousands of mundane interactions and a handful of dramatic ones. Rumor culture focuses exclusively on the dramatic potential. Hotels become symbols of anonymity. You can meet anyone there. No one knows who's staying where. Anything could happen. Those phrases are repeated so often they feel factual. But the reality is far less exciting. Luxury hotels are structured environments. Staff logs exist. Security protocols exist. Movements are often tracked internally, which raises an uncomfortable inconsistency. If something truly scandalous occurred, there would be traces. And yet, in this narrative, there are none. No leaked records. No named witnesses. No verifiable sightings. Instead, there's atmosphere. And atmosphere is harder to challenge than facts, because you can't disprove a feeling. That's what makes Santa Barbara such an effective stage. It allows storytellers to imply secrecy without demonstrating it. Now let's address the idea of the hotel owner. In rumors like this, owners are often portrayed as shadowy figures. Powerful, connected, operating behind the scenes. That image taps into a familiar trope. The wealthy individual who controls access, who opens doors, who trades opportunity for loyalty. It's a trope that appears in movies, novels, and gossip narratives constantly. And once that trope is activated, people stop asking basic questions. What kind of owner? What role do they actually play day to day? How involved are they with guests? Those details get flattened. The owner becomes a symbol rather than a person. And symbols don't need logic. They need resonance. So when people repeat this rumor, they're not thinking about hospitality management. They're thinking about power dynamics. And power dynamics are emotionally charged, especially when layered onto a figure like Meghan Markle, whose public story already involves themes of access, status, and visibility. Now here's where the narrative gets even more interesting. The rumor doesn't accuse the hotel of wrongdoing. It doesn't claim illegal activity. It simply suggests proximity and implication. That's intentional, because accusing a place or business directly invites legal scrutiny. But implying something happened within its walls, that's safer. It allows storytellers to benefit from the association without crossing lines. And once that association is established, it sticks. People start referencing that hotel without even naming it. It becomes shorthand. And shorthand is powerful. It signals shared knowledge. It creates an in-group of people who know what's being talked about without needing specifics. That's how rumors gain cultural traction. But let's slow down again and ask the question most people avoid. If Santa Barbara is so private, if luxury hotels are so controlled, why would this story leak at all? That's the contradiction at the heart of the narrative. The very qualities that make the rumor appealing also make it unlikely. Discretion doesn't produce gossip. It suppresses it. And yet, rumor culture assumes the opposite. It assumes privacy equals scandal, which reveals more about audience expectation than reality. People want the quiet places to hide loud secrets. It makes the world feel more dramatic. Now think about timing again. This rumor didn't emerge after a major public appearance. It didn't follow a paparazzi photo. It wasn't tied to a confirmed event. It surfaced in a vacuum, which suggests it wasn't reacting to reality. It was filling space. And space is important. When there's a lull in confirmed news, speculation rushes in to occupy attention. Santa Barbara, with its vague mystique, becomes the perfect filler. It feels specific without being checkable. That's the sweet spot. Specific enough to visualize, vague enough to avoid refutation. And once creators started referencing the location, it gave the story legs. Viewers could picture it. Commenters could embellish it. The narrative could evolve. Now let's talk about why audiences trust location-based rumors more than others. Because places feel objective. A person can lie. A place feels neutral. If someone says, "This happened at a luxury hotel in Santa Barbara," it sounds grounded, concrete, even if nothing else is. And that grounding effect lowers skepticism. People think, well, that's a real place, as if that makes the claim stronger. But a real place doesn't validate an imagined event. It just anchors it emotionally. And emotional anchoring is far more effective than evidence. This is why rumors set in vague locations struggle. "This happened somewhere overseas" doesn't stick. "This happened at a luxury hotel in Santa Barbara" does. Now here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Once a location is attached to a rumor, people begin projecting their own experiences onto it. Someone who stayed at a luxury hotel imagines how easy secrecy could be. Someone who hasn't imagines it as a playground for the elite. Both interpretations reinforce belief, even though they contradict each other. And contradictions, again, don't weaken the story. They widen its appeal. That's how this narrative absorbed so many interpretations without collapsing. But there's another layer. Santa Barbara isn't just private. It's adjacent. Close enough to Hollywood to feel relevant. Far enough to feel removed. That liminal position makes it perfect for stories about transition, secrecy, and escape. And escape narratives are especially compelling. They suggest retreat from scrutiny, which feeds suspicion. So the rumor doesn't just say, "This happened." It implies, "This happened away from prying eyes." And that implication makes people lean in. Now let's connect this back to the Liam Neeson angle. By pairing a respected, grounded figure with a location known for discretion, the story achieves balance. Authority plus secrecy. Credibility plus mystery. That combination is irresistible, even to people who claim they don't believe gossip, because it doesn't feel like gossip. It feels like something you weren't supposed to hear, and that feeling is intoxicating. But here's the reality check. If we remove the symbolism, if we strip away the atmosphere, if we ignore the emotional cues, what are we left with? A rumor with no witnesses, no documents, no corroboration, just implication layered on implication. And yet, it continues to spread, which tells us the story isn't surviving on facts. It's surviving on structure. And that structure is reinforced by place. So when people ask, why Santa Barbara? The answer isn't logistical. It's psychological. Because Santa Barbara doesn't need to prove anything. It just needs to exist in the imagination. And once it does, it becomes the perfect container FO. That's how labels silence critical thinking. They turn inquiry into identity. Now let's talk about how repetition solidified this label. Once a few creators used the same language, it became normalized. Not because it was accurate, but because it was familiar. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort breeds acceptance. Viewers heard the same phrasing over and over again. They didn't consciously agree with it. They just stopped questioning it. This is called narrative fatigue. When a story is repeated enough, people stop engaging analytically. They engage emotionally. And emotionally, labels are easier than nuance. But here's another contradiction. The people applying this label often pride themselves on being anti-elite, anti-power, anti-manipulation. Yet they rely on the same reductive storytelling methods used by tabloids for decades. They criticize media manipulation while reproducing it, because outrage is contagious, and participating in it feels empowering. Now let's connect this back to Santa Barbara and the hotel. Once the label was in place, the location became evidence, even though nothing changed. The same lack of proof existed. But now, the absence of evidence was interpreted differently. It makes sense there wouldn't be proof. That's how these things work. They're too powerful to leave a trail. See how the logic flips? Before, no proof meant uncertainty. After the label, no proof meant sophistication. This is how narratives become self-sealing. Every challenge strengthens them. Now consider how this affects public perception. Once a label like this sticks, future actions get reinterpreted. A business meeting becomes suspicious. A private trip becomes strategic. A silence becomes confirmation. And the person at the center loses the ability to act neutrally. Everything becomes performance. That's the cost of labels. They don't just describe. They constrain. And that constraint doesn't end when the rumor fades. Because labels have memory. Even when the story moves on, the association remains. Which is why these narratives are so damaging even when unproven. They reshape perception permanently. Now here's the part that most people don't want to acknowledge. The label didn't emerge organically. It was introduced because it fit the incentive structure. It made the story more clickable, more provocative, more polarizing. And polarization drives engagement. Platforms reward it. Algorithms amplify it. Creators who resisted using it saw lower engagement. Creators who leaned into it saw spikes. That feedback loop encourages escalation, not accuracy. And that's how narratives drift. Not because people are malicious, but because systems reward simplification. Now ask yourself this. If this story didn't involve a woman with a history of media controversy, if it involved someone less polarizing, would the label have taken hold so quickly? Probably not. That tells us something important. This wasn't just about a rumor. It was about readiness. The audience was primed. And once primed, the label slid into place with very little resistance. But there's another layer here that rarely gets discussed. Labels like this also redirect attention away from structural issues. They personalize what might otherwise be systemic. Instead of asking how power operates in industries, people focus on individual morality. Instead of questioning access structures, they judge personal character. That shift is convenient because it keeps the system invisible, and visibility is dangerous to systems. So labels serve a purpose beyond scandal. They protect complexity from scrutiny. Now let's bring this back to the narrative arc. At this point in the story, we have a rumor with vague origins, a respected name used as credibility scaffolding, a location that amplifies secrecy, and a label that reframes everything. The story is now fully formed. It doesn't need new information. It just needs repetition. But something else starts to happen at this stage. Counter-narratives emerge. People push back. They question the label. They point out the lack of evidence. And instead of weakening the story, that resistance strengthens it. Because now it feels contested. And contested stories feel important. People assume, if everyone's arguing about it, there must be something there. That's another trap. Controversy becomes validation. And once that happens, the narrative enters its most dangerous phase. Normalization, where people stop framing it as rumor and start framing it as background context. You know, after everything that came out, given what we've heard, in light of those allegations, those phrases sneak into conversation quietly. And before anyone notices, the label has become part of the assumed backstory. That's how reputations are rewritten without evidence. Not through headlines. Through implication. So let's end this chapter with the question that should haunt all of us. If a single label can reshape an entire narrative, if it can override facts, amplify suspicion, and silence nuance, who is responsible when that label turns out to be false? The person who invented it? The person who repeated it? Or the audience who rewarded it? Because in the next section, we're going to examine how silence, from all sides, feeds these narratives. And why not responding can sometimes be the most dangerous move of all. Because when no one speaks, the story speaks for them. And it rarely tells the truth. What happens when no one responds? Not a denial. Not a clarification. Not even a carefully worded non-statement. Just silence. That's where this story enters its most misunderstood phase. Chapter 5. Because silence, in rumor culture, is never neutral. It gets interpreted. It gets weaponized. And most dangerously, it gets rewritten. Let's start with a hard truth most people don't like hearing. Silence does not mean guilt. Silence does not mean confirmation. Silence does not mean something is being hidden. In real life, silence often means the opposite. It means lawyers. It means risk assessment. It means choosing not to legitimize something by responding to it. But rumor culture doesn't operate on real-world logic. It operates on narrative hunger. And silence creates a vacuum. Vacuum demands filling. So when neither side responds, not the alleged speaker, not the alleged subject, the internet does what it always does. It fills the silence with story. People start narrating motives. She's quiet because. He hasn't denied it because. They're letting it blow over because. Each sentence begins with speculation, but ends with certainty. And certainty spreads faster than doubt. Here's the contradiction that sits at the center of this entire chapter. If someone responds, the story explodes. If they don't respond, the story festers. There is no winning move once a rumor reaches critical mass. And this one did. So let's examine why silence becomes so powerful. In traditional media, silence was often respected. No comment meant no comment. But social media collapsed that boundary. Now silence is treated like a message, whether or not it's intended to be one. And people don't just interpret it passively. They narrate it actively. Silence becomes suspicious because it denies the audience resolution. And unresolved stories drive engagement. Think about it. A denial ends conversation. A confirmation redirects it. But silence keeps it alive. It invites interpretation. And interpretation is participatory. Viewers don't just consume the story anymore. They co-author it. They decide what silence means. And once a collective interpretation forms, it hardens. This is where the rumor becomes self-sustaining. Because now, even if someone were to respond later, it wouldn't matter. The narrative has already settled. Now let's talk about why people expect responses in the first place. Because somewhere along the way, the public began believing they are owed explanations. Every rumor demands a statement. Every allegation demands a rebuttal. Every whisper demands validation. And when that expectation isn't met, frustration turns into suspicion. But that expectation ignores reality. Responding to rumors often does more harm than good. A denial becomes a headline. A clarification becomes misquoted. A statement becomes dissected line by line. And worst of all, responding signals importance. It tells the algorithm this story matters. So silence, from a strategic standpoint, is often the least damaging option. But strategy doesn't satisfy spectators. And spectators want narrative closure. So they create it themselves. This is where confirmation bias steps in. People who already believe the rumor see silence as proof. People who doubt it see silence as prudence. But the loudest voices tend to dominate. And loud voices rarely belong to skeptics. Now consider how this silence interacts with the label introduced earlier. Once someone is labeled, silence reinforces that label. Not because it confirms it, but because it allows the label to go unchallenged. No counter-narrative appears. No competing explanation circulates. So the label becomes the default assumption. And defaults are powerful. People don't actively choose them. They accept them unconsciously. This is how reputations erode quietly. Not through evidence. Through absence. And that absence becomes interpreted as intent. She wants it to fade. He's protecting someone. They're too powerful to care. Each explanation reinforces the idea that something exists behind the silence, even when nothing does. Now let's talk about how creators exploit silence. Because silence is content. It allows speculation without risk. Creators can say, "Notice how no one has denied this. Interesting that there's been no response." Silence speaks volumes. Those phrases sound analytical, but they're rhetorical traps. They frame silence as evidence without saying it outright, and that's legally safer, but narratively potent. This is where responsible analysis ends and insinuation begins. But the audience doesn't always notice the difference. They hear implication. They feel conclusion. And once that happens, the story advances another stage. People begin referencing the rumor as context, not as allegation, not as theory, as background. Given what's been said, after everything that's circulating, in light of the situation, those phrases sneak into conversation almost unnoticed. And suddenly, the rumor isn't being debated anymore. It's being assumed. This is the most dangerous moment in any rumor's life cycle, when it stops being questioned, because now it has social permission. Now let's address another contradiction. Silence is often criticized as arrogance. People say things like, if it weren't true, they'd clear it up. They think they're above addressing it. That interpretation frames restraint as superiority, which fuels resentment. And resentment feeds outrage. Outrage keeps the story alive. So silence doesn't just fail to stop the rumor. It becomes part of its fuel. Now let's flip perspective for a moment. What if the rumor is completely false? What if there is nothing to clarify because nothing happened? Responding would still legitimize it. It would elevate a baseless claim into a public dispute. It would create a he said, she said, where none existed. So silence, in that case, is protection. But the internet rarely rewards protection. It rewards performance. And silence isn't performative, which is why it gets punished. Now here's something even more uncomfortable. The audience often claims they want truth, but behavior suggests they want drama, because silence delays resolution, and delayed resolution keeps them engaged. They don't actually want the story to end. They want it to continue. So they punish silence publicly while benefiting from it privately. They complain about lack of response, while consuming every piece of content built around that lack. This is the paradox. Now let's examine how silence affects the alleged speaker. When a name is used without confirmation, responding becomes risky. Denial might draw attention to something most people hadn't heard of. Acknowledgement might be misinterpreted, and ignoring it avoids escalation, but invites assumption. So silence becomes the least bad option. But rumor culture doesn't measure options by risk. It measures them by spectacle, and silence offers none. So the audience fills the gap with imagination. And imagination, unchecked, becomes belief. This is where the narrative starts rewriting history. People begin saying things like, "This has been rumored for a while. Everyone knows about this. It's an open secret." Those phrases create the illusion of longevity. Longevity suggests truth, even when it's manufactured. Now let's talk about memory. Rumors don't need to be proven to be remembered. They just need to be repeated. And silence allows repetition to continue unchallenged, which means memory forms without correction. Months later, people won't remember the lack of evidence. They'll remember the association, the hotel, the location, the label, and they'll remember silence as part of the story, not as absence, as presence. Which brings us to the most ironic part of all. Silence is often intended to starve a rumor. But in an attention economy, silence can act like oxygen. It keeps the flame alive quietly. It allows others to control the narrative. And once control is lost, it's almost impossible to reclaim. This is why so many public figures feel trapped. Responding amplifies. Not responding implies. There is no neutral move. And that reality gets exploited. Now let's connect this back to the broader structure. At this stage, the story has a vague origin, an authoritative name, a symbolic location, a powerful label, and strategic silence. It is now complete. It doesn't need truth. It needs circulation. And circulation is driven by one thing above all else: incentive. Which brings us to the next question. Who benefits from silence? Who benefits when no one corrects the record? Who gains clicks, views, engagement, and relevance? Because in the next section, we're going to follow the incentive trail. We're going to look at who profits from keeping this story alive, even without evidence. And once you see how outrage is monetized, you'll understand why some rumors are never meant to be resolved. They're meant to be sustained. And what comes next will make you question every just asking questions video you've ever watched. Who actually gains when a rumor refuses to die? Not emotionally, not morally, but materially. That's the question most people never follow to its end. And it's where this story stops being about individuals and starts being about incentives. Welcome to Chapter 6. Because once you trace the money, the attention, and the algorithmic rewards, the persistence of this narrative suddenly makes sense. Let's begin with an uncomfortable admission. Most viral scandals don't survive because people believe them. They survive because people engage with them. Belief is optional. Engagement is everything. And engagement is profitable. Every click, every comment, every reaction, they all feed the same machine. So when you ask, why is this story still circulating? The answer isn't mystery. It's math. Let's talk about content creators first. Not the big media outlets. Not journalists bound by editorial standards. The mid-tier creators. The commentary channels. The reaction accounts. The let's talk about this voices who thrive in gray areas. These creators live in a specific ecosystem. They need controversy, but not accountability. They need plausible deniability, but maximum emotion. They need stories that feel explosive but can't be definitively resolved. This rumor checks every box. It's vague enough to avoid verification. It's provocative enough to spark outrage. And it involves names that guarantee clicks, which means it's reusable. A single rumor can fuel dozens of videos. Breaking down the timeline. What this really means. Why the silence is suspicious. The psychological angle. The power dynamics. None of those require new information. They just repackage the same speculation from different angles. And each angle becomes monetized. That's the first incentive. But it goes deeper. Because once a creator posts content on a rumor like this and sees engagement spike, something happens psychologically. They associate controversy with reward. Higher views, higher comments, higher visibility. And the algorithm reinforces that lesson. It promotes the content. It recommends it. It surfaces it to new viewers. So the creator learns quickly. This works. Now imagine being that creator and seeing someone else's video on the same rumor outperform yours. What do? You escalate. You add emphasis. You sharpen language. You lean harder into implication. Not because you're malicious, but because the system demands novelty. And novelty, in rumor culture, usually means intensity. This is how narratives drift toward extremity. Not because anyone sat down to lie, but because moderation underperforms. Now let's talk about the audience's role. Because incentives don't exist without consumers. And audiences are not passive here. They reward content emotionally. Outrage comments, sarcastic replies, defensive arguments. All of that counts as engagement. In fact, negative engagement often performs better than positive. The algorithm doesn't care why you're commenting. It cares that you are. So when viewers argue in comment sections, whether for or against the rumor, they are extending its lifespan. Every debate thread pushes the video further. Every argument signals relevance, which means even people trying to debunk the rumor help circulate it. That's the paradox. Now consider how outrage functions psychologically. Outrage creates a sense of participation. It makes people feel informed, morally engaged, on the right side of something, even if the thing itself is unverified. Outrage also simplifies complexity. It turns uncertainty into certainty. And certainty feels good, especially in a chaotic information environment. So audiences gravitate toward content that tells them how to feel. And rumors like this are perfect for that. They offer moral clarity without factual burden. Now let's zoom out further. Platforms themselves benefit from prolonged controversy. Longer watch times, higher session durations, more ad impressions, resolved stories and engagement. Unresolved ones loop. Which is why the most profitable narratives are the ones that never reach conclusion. They keep people coming back for updates that never really update. And this story fits that model perfectly. No definitive proof means no definitive end. So there's always something new to discuss, even when nothing new has happened. Now let's talk about language choices. Notice how often creators say things like, "We're just discussing what's out there. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just analyzing the narrative." Those phrases serve a dual purpose. They protect the speaker, and they invite speculation. They create a sense of responsibility while delivering implication. That balance is extremely profitable because it allows creators to benefit from scandal without owning it. Now think about the feedback loop. A creator posts a speculative video. Engagement spikes. Other creators notice. They post their own takes. Suddenly, the story feels bigger. Not because of evidence, but because